I think my grandpa is a part of a cult. How else can I explain his strange ritual of dying? I'm a passionate guitar player and have played in multiple bands in the past, but I have also performed in several small events like charity events. Now that I'm a full-time student, I hardly find the time for that anymore, but I like to take the time to at least strum the strings privately. Some time ago, I received the news that my grandfather Wally was hospitalized after suffering a stroke. This was his second and apparently his most severe. I like Wally. He was always one of my favorite members in the family. He always knew how to make me and my siblings laugh. He was always the one who cheered us up at every family gathering when arguments arose that always happen at such gatherings. He knew good jokes and funny anecdotes. He never had a hard time being in a good mood. So much for Wally's good qualities. But if there's one thing that bothers me about him, it's his obsession with the paranormal. I can't explain it any other way, as I don't know enough about it myself. Most of what I know stems from rumors and hearsay from family. All I know is that Wally is so deep in his obsession that he's apparently joined a cult himself. I wonder if the whole thing has something to do with the fact that he lost his wife, my grandmother, to whom he was married for 34 years a few years ago. Maybe it's all a coping mechanism. He's never spoken about it himself, and no one really dares to ask him about it. If anyone has ever tried, whatever is going on, it has never hurt us as a family before, so we let him do, and we stuck to the usual rumors without making a fuss about it. Anyway, my mom called me the other day and asked me to go visit Wally. He had a request for me. He also asked me to bring my guitar. As much as I found Wally's obscure preferences odd, my love for him was stronger. So I grabbed my guitar and drove to the hospital in my small town. A nurse led me to Wally's wing, and the second he saw me, his bright smile was more contagious than the diseases that roamed this place. "My boy, you've grown so much." I walked up to him and hugged him tightly. He only put one arm around me while his other dangled from the bed. "You don't look too bad yourself. A stroke suits me pretty well, doesn't it?" He raised his numb arm and swung it around like a bell. I had to laugh. His sense of humor was offbeat, but still with the realm of normality, in contrast to his private preferences. "You brought the guitar with you. That's fantastic. I know how much you like to play. Why did you want me to bring it, Grandpa? I thought you could play me some songs. It's so lonely in this hospital. I could use some entertainment." So I put the guitar strap around my neck and strummed the strings a little while tuning them. "What would you like to hear?" "It doesn't matter, but please no gospel stuff. That's not my thing." I wondered if Wally had ever said anything about his faith, let alone whether he was an atheist. But I didn't ask because I considered it a personal matter. So I played a few songs that fresh in my mind and that I had played at a few events before. Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, Hotel California by the Eagles, Dust in the Wind by Kansas, Help by the Beatles. Basic stuff. Not too much, not too lame. Wally enjoyed the music very much. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened attentively, and seemed to reflect on the best memories of his life. Suddenly the hospital had become less lonely and more of a refuge of nostalgia. He no longer cared that he was dying, even though it hardly seemed as if he ever feared death before. At one point, I was in a strong flow myself, and played song after song, as if I was on autoplay. After a while I played That's Life by Frank Sinatra, and as soon as I finished, Wally grabbed my guitar, and the flow was gone. He held the neck and said with strange delight, "That's it. That's the song." He didn't tell me what he meant by that. At first, I thought he just liked the song the best of all, which I can understand very well. Then it dawned on me. He wanted to hear this song on his deathbed as a farewell to his past life. Fast forward 2 months later, I got the news that Wally's health had deteriorated significantly and that he would be spending his final hours in hospice care. This news alone was hard to digest, but when I was asked to once again come over and bring my guitar, I struggled with the idea of how I would cope. I didn't want to watch my grandpa pass away, but I knew I had to fulfill his final wish. So I went to see him again, this time to a hospice near the hospital. I had never been to a hospice before, but I assumed that the conditions would be no different to a normal hospital environment, perhaps a little more home-like and safe. The place I arrived at, however, looked completely different. I found myself in a large hall with 2 beds lined up next to each other. The hall was dark except for torches and candles on the walls and tables that lit up the room. The walls were covered in drawings that I couldn't explain. Many of the drawings looked like mysterious ornaments and symbols. Some of them looked like ancient scriptures. I felt like I was in a cave. There was a lot of space between the 2 beds. A row of black crosses on the floor decorated the hall. I assumed that more beds would be added soon, and the crosses had been drawn on temporarily. I recognized my grandpa on one of the beds. He waved to me and asked me to come over. I walked past the other bed, in which another elderly man was lying. Next to him, a young woman, about my age, with a harp in her lap. She gave me a strange look. I had the feeling that she wanted to speak to me, but just didn't have the courage. Wally hugged me when I got to his bed. "So good to have you back?" I looked Wally up and down. He looked really bad. His skin was very faded and bony. His few hairs had taken on the color of his teeth. It was a miracle he was still alive. "Are you ready?" he asked me intensely. "Yes, Grandpa. That's life, right?" He nodded. But then the older man from the other bed spoke up. "Hey, Wally, we agreed that I'd go first." Wally clapped at his head. "I'm sorry, Al. I'll let your niece go first then." The woman at AL's side picked up the harp and gently pulled the strings. Very gently. She looked at me. Her eyes looked glassy. Her fingers were shaking as much as the strings. She seemed desperate. "Come on, Estella. I'd like to retire today." I called out, slightly irritated. I don't want to wait another 2 months. Tears welled up in Estella's eyes. She slowly turned her gaze away from me. She seemed to love her uncle even more than I loved my grandfather, which is why she was mourning him so much. A slow but beautiful melody came from the harp. After a few notes, I recognized the song immediately. Hallelujah. Despite her weak state of mind, she played the song like a professional harpist, without making a mistake. I sat down next to my grandpa, mesmerized, and watched Estella as she gave her uncle a piece of magic for his passing. At that moment, AL's bed suddenly lit up. It seemed like a magical entity, but then I looked down at the legs of the bed. They caught fire. I jumped up and dropped my guitar. The fire rose up and surrounded the rest of the bed. Suno caught fire too. His entire face was covered in a fiery red vortex. He rocked back and forth. Through the flames, I could make out the outline of his face, and it seemed as if he was screaming. But the sound he made sounded less like a pained scream and more like a maniacal laugh. The sound quickly died down, and I knew the larynx had melted away. While Al was burning, Estella suddenly suffered the same fate. Her dress, which was initially blue, turned orange, and in a matter of seconds she too was enveloped in a fiery vortex. She fell to the side and struggled for rescue. She kept screaming, "Mom," as if adrenaline was about to shoot out of my skin at any moment. I ran over to Estella and put my jacket on her body, hoping to put out the fire, but after just 3 seconds, my jacket was gone too. All I could do was sit there and watch her die. Her arm was the only part of her body to rise from the ground one last time. Most of the skin remained on the floor, trailing threads of skin and veins. The arm reached towards me. I instinctively reached for it until Wally behind me shouted with all the strength he had left, "Don't touch her. She's not completely burned yet." I sat back and continued to watch as her body charred into a skeleton covered in roasted meat. In the light of the fire, I could see the drawings on the wall glow brightly. After what felt like an eternity, the last bit of embers had burned out. In the background, I heard someone coming towards us from another room. There were 2 men, dressed in janitor's uniforms, who were burying the skeletons of Estella and Al in garbage bags. They swept up the remains and ashes with a shovel and broom. Then they drew 2 strips of tape on the floor and eventually left the hall. Where there had been a bed with 2 people, there was now a huge black cross. "Now it's our turn, my boy," I heard Wally say behind me in a cheerful tone. I slowly stood up and turned to him. He was smiling from ear to ear. "I can't, Grandpa," I said, whimpering. I didn't know how else to express my feelings. Wally's smile faded slightly. "But I chose you. I chose the song. I'm ready." I looked again at his corpse-like body, his missing teeth, his pale skin, his lack of brains. This was the same man I had cherished and looked up to all these years, and who had now betrayed me beyond belief. At this moment, I would have loved to take my guitar and literally smash it into his mind. But I had another plan. "I'm not ready yet." With these words, I walked out of the building, didn't look back, and started running when I felt the daylight on my skin. In the background, I heard my grandpa whimpering. He called something after me, but it was hard to understand because he was mumbling due to his condition. He said something along the lines of, "I chose you." That happened 3 days ago, and as I write this down, a lot has happened since then. Immediately after I escaped, I told my parents and technically my entire family everything. Most of them dismissed my story as an exaggeration or even a lie, but luckily my parents were on my side and believed me. We told everything to the police, and they wanted to take a look at the situation themselves. They said they had checked out the hospice, and the building's managers had an explanation for everything. There was no law prohibiting murals or candles and torches as the only light source. They also believed the explanation that the crosses on the floor were temporarily drawn for future beds. But what really shuddered me was the fact that Wally was still there and, as it seemed, waiting for me. But that's not all. Since my escape, unfortunate things have happened within my family. 2 days ago, my aunt was the victim of a pileup that she barely survived. My uncle's company went bankrupt yesterday, and this morning I found out that my cousin had suffered a miscarriage. I wouldn't have found this series of events quite so obscure if it hadn't been for the letter I received before writing this down. The sender was Wally's hospice, and on a piece of paper, there was just one sentence. "I'm waiting for you."